Hi everybody, Shannon Petrovich with Therapist Talks. Today is Boundaries Part 2, Physical Boundaries, Me Too, and You. Remember from our first boundaries video, we defined boundaries as the ever-changing, invisible, but critically important buffer zone between you and others. They are personal and profoundly important, and if there's one thing that I probably end up talking about at every therapy session with every client, it's boundaries. We talked about body language and especially spatial awareness, and how we can use our spatial body movements to assert our own personal space. And then we focused on emotional boundaries. In this video, we'll focus on physical boundaries, sexual violations, shame, and accountability. I'll be using gender pronouns to acknowledge that most violators are men and most victims are women, but this is not to denigrate those men who have been victims or to let off the hook women who violate. When I worked with small children in a program in Maine, I used to have the kids stand up and put their arms out and spin around and tell them, these are your boundaries. No one can come into your personal space unless you invite them, and you cannot go into another's personal space unless they invite you. This sounds silly and simplistic, but this is still true for us as adults, and we need to recognize and assert those boundaries better. The other image I like to employ with clients is the Star Trek force fields. If you've seen Star Trek, they can put up force fields around the ship when the Klingons are attacking. We need to have a sense of our own force fields, and that we drop our shields only when we feel close to and we want physical contact from another. We've probably all had the experience, and I've had lots of clients say they allowed a person to hug them even though they did not want to be touched, did not feel closeness with that person, and even felt creeped out. They didn't want to be rude, and often as women, we're taught to put politeness above everything else, even our own comfort zone, our own privacy, and our own personal space. But our personal space takes precedence, and I believe it's important to assert your space and to be rude if necessary. It's kind of an old standard truism that we teach others how to treat us. This is never to blame someone for another's bad behavior. But if we allow unwanted contact in order to not be rude, what is that telling the person about us? It's better to allow them to feel how rude they are being than for us to be seen as weak, meek, or boundaryless. We also want to match our assertiveness to the affront. We can start with the most subtle, turning away, extending a hand, turning and waving goodbye. You can create space by stepping back, holding your hands up, pulling away, and making sure that your facial expression is consistent with your intentions. We do not need to smile and be pleasant when someone is invading our space. If that's not effective, a more stern approach is needed, and it's important to know that you have an escalation plan in mind so that just as the horse in video 1 ultimately gets his point across with kicks and bites if necessary, we know that we can go to the max too. It's often true that boundary violations of a sexual nature start with subtle violations. An off-color joke, a flirtation, a question about your sex life. This is a fishing expedition, and if this goes unchecked, the violator will take it to the next step and on and on. When forensic psychologists have interviewed perpetrators in prison, the consistent message is that they look for a child or a woman who was nice, compliant, weak, or meek. Again, this is not to blame the victim, but just to help us all put our shields up and our armor on when we need it. We've all had someone come on to us at a gathering, and not just at parties, but even family gatherings and funerals. And often in hindsight, we realized we were polite for too long. You do not have to be. Recognize your discomfort as a warning sign. Go back to the video on anger. Recognize that your anger is a protective energy that was designed to set a boundary, help us walk away, help us get with others, and help us to use that anger to fight, flight, and not to freeze. Recognize those fishing expeditions and don't take the bait. Often if we think about it, there were times we could have subverted someone's intrusion sooner and with less energy. I'm very encouraged by the Me Too movement, and I hope that girls and women will not feel that they have to put up with unwanted advances. They will know that they can set boundaries and uphold them, and that they can tell someone, be heard, and be protected from retaliation. 30 years ago, I worked in a workplace where sexualized joking was the norm. Initially, I wanted to be accepted, so I put up with it and laughed at all the right times. But it really wasn't funny, and it was more and more disgusting and was making me uncomfortable. So I stopped laughing. Ultimately, I stopped having lunch with the group. which unfortunately included the entire upper management of the organization. I certainly did not feel there was any recourse or way to tell someone to make it stop. So I showed up, did my work, minimized contact with the group, and felt very much isolated. But I'm glad I at least did not stay in the uncomfortable environment and didn't make myself sit there and laugh while being uncomfortable. Verbal sexual talk, if unwanted, is a boundary violation. If the violation is subtle, be subtle, but then be more clear and more forceful if it doesn't stop. Know that in this day and age, as opposed to 30 years ago, you have the right to make it stop and to make it stop in any setting. If it makes you uncomfortable, this is your creepometer going off, and it is valid and legitimate, and it is your right to make it stop. I heard an interview on NPR the other day about a woman who worked with a famous playwright. She talked about his sexual advances and ultimately his attempted assault on her, and how she was left with this intense anger she couldn't shake. She described the situation and how she used really good boundaries and escalated as he escalated, and she ultimately got out of there. And she told people, but she wasn't heard for many years. Finally, other women came forward, and then her story was heard too. She talked about feeling rage for those intervening years. Remember the video on anger? This is legitimate anger and needs expression. It frustrates me when people ask, why are women so angry? Well, many women are not angry enough. Instead, they carry shame. One of the strange things about human behavior is that if the perpetrator of something, especially of a sexual nature, does not get the blame, we carry the shame. And when we keep that shame to ourselves, it grows into an ugly, huge monstrosity of shame inside us. It's critical to get that out to somebody. Share it with someone you can trust. Sharing it and hearing someone assert that it was not your fault is a critical step in getting that shame out of you. I've worked with women who literally carried shame for 60 or 70 years, and it defined their entire lives with shame and self-hatred. If you can then get your voice heard and the perpetrator is held accountable, that's even better. Then you are supported and the perpetrator takes the shame of what he did and not you. I'm glad that we're seeing all of this come into the light. Shining light into these previously dark places gives us all the freedom to have solid boundaries, to know that they are our right to assert, and to bring shameful behavior into the public square so the violator feels that shame and the victim doesn't carry that blame. In summary, know that it's your right to have your personal space be sacred and it belongs to you. Notice violations that make you uncomfortable and assert your boundaries in gradations of subtle to assertive to aggressive if necessary. Stop thinking that you have to be polite or that you have to accept unwanted sexual attention or touch. Talk about it if you've been violated. Again, to get that shame out where it belongs and to get the anger outside of your body where it will do damage. If you found this video helpful, please hit like and subscribe. Leave me your thoughts in the comments, ask questions, or make suggestions for future topics. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.